Homo sapiens is a truly unique species in many ways. For instance, social animal societies have typically evolved over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. Our ancestors, early Homo species, spent nearly their entire history living in small groups of just a few dozen individuals. But the advent of agrarian societies led to a rapid increase in population density and the formation of the first states. From a natural perspective, something extraordinary happened. It's almost like a pack of monkeys suddenly turning into an ant colony. Naturally, such transformations brought about many new phenomena, one of which was large-scale warfare. Most people, however, view wars as a relic of barbarity, something belonging to the past. Yet even a quick glance at history supports the conclusion of German sociologist Erich Fromm. The number and scale of wars have increased alongside technological advances and the growing power of governments. The medieval era, in the minds of many, is a time of constant conflict. It seems like Eurasia was repeatedly ravaged by destructive wars. This perception, in part, stems from how we inaccurately align events with their time periods. For example, the First World War feels distant, even though it's only about a century away. The Middle Ages, in contrast, spanned over 1,000 years. While that period is packed with war dates, many conflicts were more like neighborhood disputes from the 1990s, and some were largely ceremonial. Take Charlemagne's war with the Saxons. It officially lasted over 30 years, but there were only 2 battles. His campaigns in Italy in 773 to 774 and against Duke Tassilo of Bavaria didn't involve any fighting at all. Unlike modern wars with front lines stretching hundreds of kilometers, medieval wars were more like military expeditions conducted by a single army into enemy territory. Often, the size of forces in a given battle equaled the total number of troops involved in the entire war. To illustrate the scale, let's take the Battle of Crécy in 1346, one of the largest battles of the 100 Years' War. It involved about 35,000 participants. That number might seem impressive, but if you picture all those soldiers packed as a standing crowd of 5 people per square meter, a density lower than in a subway, they'd fit on a standard football field. The English forces alone would occupy about 1/3 of it, roughly an area of 65 by 30 meters. Someone with a 5,000 square meter backyard could fit the entire English army on their land. At the time of the Battle of Crécy, the combined population of France and England was about 15 million, meaning only 0.23% of their populations participated. The overall death toll of the 100 Years' War is estimated at 2 to 3 million. Considering the war spanned 116 years, with at least 4 generations passing, and involved many nations beyond France and England, these losses likely amounted to just a few percent of the populations of the participating countries. By comparison, in the largest conflict of our modern era, World War II, about 127 million people fought in battles according to documented sources. That's 5.7% of the world's population at the time, and not all countries were involved. In total, 3.2% of the global population died. Contrary to cinematic cliches, a defeated army in a medieval battle wasn't completely annihilated. At Crécy, the French lost about 15% of their forces. At Poitiers or Agincourt, losses were closer to 40%, which was catastrophic for the time. More often, medieval European wars were not particularly bloody. They were referred to as knightly wars. For example, at the Battle of Bremeul in 1119, about 1,000 knights clashed, and the losses amounted to just 3 men. Sometimes conflicts were resolved through individual or group duels. It's even suggested that feudal lords avoided large battles out of fear that losing would signal divine disfavor. Over time, historians' estimates of medieval army sizes have shifted dramatically. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, these armies were often thought to number in the hundreds of thousands. Today, thanks to archaeological and other evidence, those estimates have been revised down to tens of thousands, or even just a few thousand in some cases. For instance, the battle on the ice was once believed to involve tens of thousands of participants. However, historian Igor Danilevsky estimates the forces included around 40 German knights, 160 mercenary knechts, and a few hundred Estonian mercenaries known in Rus as Chud. According to the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, the Germans lost 20 knights killed and 6 captured. The Novgorod First Chronicle, however, reports the death of 500 Germans, though such written sources are not entirely reliable. It's like the old anecdote. After a victory over the Turks, A staff officer asked General Suvorov what casualty numbers to report to St. Petersburg. Suvorov replied, "Just add more. Why spare the infidels?" Similarly, estimates of nomadic forces invading Russes in the 19th and 20th centuries ranged from 500,000 to 60,000. More recent studies suggest their numbers were closer to 35 to 40,000. Without their horses, the invading horde, like the French and English at Crécy, could probably fit on a single football field. On that note, Boris Rybakov's archaeological research indicates that a Rus princely fortress could house up to 300 men, essentially the size of a princely retinue.
Kievan Rus could not muster more than 40,000 professional soldiers. Even that was impossible to gather in one place due to the political fragmentation of the region.
A later document, the 1555 Service Code, states that a landowner had to provide a mounted soldier equipped with a basic fabric armor called a taegilye if they owned between 100 and 200 chetverts of land. This is roughly 110 hectares. A single peasant family, typically consisting of about 7 people, would cultivate 4 to 5 desyatinas in fertile areas. This means one soldier was supported by about 70 to 160 peasants. And this was the 16th century, when metal became cheaper. Even then, the military slaves conscripted for service, who were often actually landless noble children rather than slaves, were not equipped with knightly armor, but rather the most affordable fabric protection, the taegilye. The agrarian society constantly required vast amounts of manual labor, meaning that there were few people available for military service. Some exceptions to this, due to the nature of their economy, were the nomads. Some sources claim that even by the mid-19th century, European economies could only arm about 0.7% of the population. Mobilizing 2 to 3% or more, as seen in the 20th century, required farm machinery in the fields and industrial machinery in factories. In medieval times, economic realities restricted conflicts to relatively small scales. Strict division of labor and centralized control over vast territories allowed the Roman Empire to maintain a large professional army for its time, but it still didn't exceed 0.7% of the total population, much like the modern era. After Rome's fall, things changed. Europe splintered into numerous political entities, and the feudal system introduced military service in exchange for land and peasants. This elite class, which formed about 1% of the population, held both governing and military roles. To draw a modern parallel, imagine government officials also doubling as the army. On top of that, each official would fund their weapons and armor from their own income. For the state, this meant the army didn't require direct funding. Those making decisions to go to war were usually the ones fighting it. Even kings dying on the battlefield wasn't unheard of. The modern concept of mobilization didn't exist. Roughly 90% of the population were peasants, most of whom were dependent on landowners by the later Middle Ages. Relying on them for warfare created many problems. First, peasants would have to be pulled from farming, causing losses, especially since wars often occurred in summer. Second, an untrained crowd armed with wooden tools was largely ineffective in battle. Before firearms, rare attempts to deploy peasant militias generally failed. Equipping them with weapons or armor and training them was prohibitively expensive. In fact, even knights didn't always have the best protection available for their time. Consider the godanda, a weapon that emerged in wealthier urban environments. Despite its simplicity, it was cheaper to produce than a basic spear. Third, there was no strict population control or record system. Peasants could easily vanish into the woods during a break or head home. Even mercenaries, like English longbowmen, occasionally disappeared after receiving their advance pay. Fourth, a peasant trained in combat could become a threat to their lord. Additionally, in infantry versus cavalry battles, cavalry could retreat if something went wrong. Infantry couldn't catch them. Infantry, however, couldn't escape a cavalry charge. Armies weren't solely composed of knights. Mercenaries from urban or rural backgrounds were often used as well. However, as in the case of the Necks, English archers, or Swiss pikemen, some were free peasants who had children, but whose land holdings didn't increase enough to pass down as inheritance. They weren't tools of the feudal lord, meaning they didn't generate direct profits. Instead, they could dedicate themselves to warfare, gaining battle experience, and often equipping themselves. But they required good pay and incurred expenses. No passports, no draft boards with organized records, no proper systems for population control or border management. As a result, an army like this could just disappear into the unknown at any moment. And it happened often enough. Even knights, despite being vassals, typically served unpaid for only 40 days during a campaign. After that, their services had to be paid for. War was an expensive business for the fragile medieval economy, even considering the relatively free service of knights. The vast majority of the population, made up of peasants, knew they'd never hold a weapon in battle. Although feudal lords made up about 1%, or in some places a few percent, of the population, fewer than half of them participated in even the largest campaigns. A military campaign was more like a thin line on a map of enemy lands. Armies could only control or loot areas within a few dozen kilometers of their route. Armies with supply trains crawled at a speed of around 15 kilometers a day, while news of their approach spread much faster. About 90% of the population lived in small villages, and it seems that soldiers mostly found empty settlements on their way as villagers fled with their valuables into nearby forests. Burning and destroying villages, as often depicted in movies, wasn't common, since land without peasants brought no profit. Peasants were valuable assets, especially when wars were aimed at acquiring new lands. City dwellers, who made up just a few percent of the population in the early Middle Ages and up to 15 to 20% later, suffered more. Cities had more to loot, and their residents weren't directly tied to feudal lords or a source of direct profit. Outcomes varied. Sometimes the men were killed, sometimes everyone was spared. When studying the Mongol invasion of Rus, it might seem like the region rose from complete ashes, considering how many cities were burned. But cities housed only a tiny fraction of the population. If the Mongols had aimed to wipe out every village and peasant, they'd have needed to crisscross the forests and chase down the hidden peasants indefinitely. Besieging cities wasn't all that common. For example, after Otto II's siege of Paris in the 10th century, the next major siege happened over 400 years later when the French tried to reclaim the city peacefully taken by the English. Rus, due to its proximity to nomads, saw sieges more often. Even so, nearly 2 centuries passed between Tokhtamysh's sacking of Moscow and Devlet-Giray's attack. Novgorod experienced only 2 sieges between the 12th and 17th centuries. Kyiv, however, suffered more. Few realized that during battles involving tens of thousands of warriors, you could pass just a couple of kilometers away and not even hear it. Clanging weapons and scattered shouts weren't that loud. A unique feature of medieval wars was the lack of weapons capable of causing significant infrastructure damage. Proper cannons and their widespread use came with the early modern period. Trebuchets were rare, and their destructive power was greatly exaggerated by contemporaries. In the forested northern regions, where wood was the primary building material, fire served as a weapon. But even burning down a village required considerable effort, and it was largely pointless. As old stories go, small peasant houses made from available materials like wood and clay could be rebuilt in days with the help of the whole village. Strange as it may sound today, with good relations among neighbors, you could essentially get a new home for free. Depending on the time and place, free access to stone, clay, and timber allowed medieval states to rebuild without needing funds from the treasury. Even cities that were destroyed or burned down were rebuilt quickly. The outcomes of battles often depended on the physical fitness of warriors, their weapon skills, teamwork, and morale. These days, a shell fired from dozens of kilometers away or a bomb dropped from a plane can wipe out hundreds of soldiers, regardless of their skills. It can also erase civilian infrastructure. A poorly trained gunman in a good position, like on high ground or in a bunker, can hold off 100 opponents. Most casualties in modern conflicts come from shrapnel, which no amount of training can help you dodge. I'm not romanticizing the Middle Ages. It was a grim and tough time, and life was harder than today. The class system stifled personal potential and, in my opinion, was an inevitable but morally repugnant phenomenon. If we're talking about war, I'll repeat what some historians have said many times before. Medieval wars were grim but straightforward affair. Despite the demographic surges and a period of relative quiet after World War II, it seems likely that the modern age, which began in 1918, has sent as many, or even more, people to their deaths on the battlefield as previous ages, both in absolute terms and relative to population size. And the elites? They cash in on the chaos, watching the suffering from their ivory towers.